There's an old saying, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. In this video, we're going to be focusing on the investigative planning process. Well, looking at planning is important, but it's also critical because good planning saves time, energy, and money. Well-written investigative plans help manage the progress and support the timeliness and thoroughness of an investigation. And it can also effectively integrate other services like intelligence, informants, polygraph, and other key parts when they are necessary and appropriate. Finally, we want to make sure that planning is done swiftly, methodically, and thoroughly because time matters in a lot of these cases. Looking for evidence of sophisticated frauds, complex criminal networks, and other obscure financial matters where the nature of the crime itself is hidden is very important, and we need a plan. We need a framework to organize and discipline our effort, especially if we're working with others, part of an investigative team. Each member needs to understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, what we're going to do, and how everyone contributes. This starts with understanding the goals of the investigation. Remember, we need to show that a crime or violation occurred, identify who was responsible, and collect all the evidence that proves or disproves the allegation. So let's think about this in a framework, the steps of an investigation. Now, these are general, they're not specific, but here's the thing. The progression of the manner of the case needs to be understood, right? Everything starts with an allegation, what we call the predication. We assess the credibility, the person making the complaint itself, to see if it has merit or credibility. Then we want to be able to develop the investigative plan, what we call the IP, because this will help identify, collect, and analyze the evidence that we need and guides us in the investigation. This all culminates with a case report that documents our findings. And so using the investigative plan, we're actually able to kind of write as we go, ensuring that we have a complete, thorough, timely, and accurate discussion of the facts. Once the main investigation is complete, we can make a referral to the appropriate administrative authority or prosecuting attorney, whoever is really going to make the decision on whether to move the case forward. These then move into the adjudicative process, and we can even look at things like gaps or areas of improvement, things like internal audits or best practices or internal controls. Remember that our role as investigators is essential. We are the fact gatherers that assist the trier of fact, so the fact finder, with their decisions. Planning is never just one and done. Not only do we do a plan, but we also want to reach and revise agreement as information changes, the objectives, the outcomes, strategies, tactics. This is especially important if we're working with others. We also need to test our own thinking on ferreting out the evidence. Effective planning is challenging, but as the Judge Learned Hand said, an endeavor that involves the intolerable burden of thought. Think about effective planning in answering 6 basic questions. Where are we? Where do we want to go? How do we get there? When do we arrive? Who is responsible? And what do we need to get there? No two investigations are exactly alike, But there are certain procedures and techniques that can be applied to enable the investigator to successfully use a framework to process these facts, which the case has been predicated, to a broader set of facts that tell the entire story. Here, we want to see and understand what the violation or suspected violation of the law, regulation, standard, or policy is. Now, there may be past crimes, which are called historical or reactive investigations, or ongoing crimes, sometimes called present, or future crimes. Understanding the allegations is critical to analyzing the type of investigation and effort that needs to be conducted. Thorough analysis of the allegation is absolutely critical. Since investigations originate from a variety of sources, including the investigator's own observations, from another agency, from a person, sometimes called a walk-in, these all need to be evaluated against the allegation, the information provided, the credibility of the person making the complaint, and reviewing other known information about the allegation and/or the subjects. The investigator's base of knowledge is identified by asking the questions about the facts surrounding the allegations. Think about these as the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, why, and how. Certainly, some of these questions may not be answered in the allegation, so the investigator must identify what hasn't been provided, what needs to be gathered, the data that needs to be validated or verified, and if there are any other unanswered questions. In some cases, new information and facts arise that may change the direction of the case. Sometimes they show further violations, and sometimes they show the subject, in fact, may not be culpable. Either way, utilizing this new information is critical and dictates a change in the goal or manner of the investigation. It may even show the need to simply discontinue the case based on lack of information or the inability to substantiate the claims or allegations. Building a library of standards is an excellent professional best practice. Keeping a list of cases that have been used in the past, including good search warrant language and statement of facts with similar fact patterns, can be really good because you don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's also important to constantly refer to the standards that you frequently deal with. For example, if you work for an insurance company conducting healthcare or insurance fraud investigations, having a book of state fraud statutes close by is very handy. In fact, you also may want to consider having a book of policies and procedures, examining potentially fraudulent claims, and all the standards for underwriting. So the investigative plan is the way forward. It's the blueprint for a house, except that it changes and frequently does. It serves as a way to show that what you're doing. If you get hit by a bus or deployed or have a significant time away from the office, it can serve as the jumping off point for another investigator who picks up your caseload. They will appreciate a well done and updated investigative plan. What follows is a brief framework for arriving at the critical information needed for an effective investigative plan. Contained in each of the questions are content categories that focus on the key information to be reviewed. Now, this also is open for creativity and is flexible. It should not produce a lot of paper, but it should reflect that the investigator knows where they are, knows where they're going, and how to get there. Records management is of critical importance, particularly in the phases of storage and retrieval and dissemination. The ability to index, catalog, and analyze are very much dependent on the management of the information in the investigative system. Without it, you really can't complete the report or produce an end product for your investigation. Each case, no matter if it hasn't been substantiated, must have some documentation regarding what was done and why it was closed. Robert O'Neill, the former fraud chief of the San Diego County District Attorney's Office, writes in his monograph on investigative planning, quote, "Prepare at the earliest stages of your investigation a master affidavit laying out the factual basis for the offense that you anticipate charging. This affidavit can be used over and over as the form of the basis for subpoenas, search warrants, court orders, and arrest warrants." End quote. The investigative plan will help guide the writing process by forcing you to identify gaps, holes, and areas to shore up. Remember that every statement must be backed up by a person who can testify to that fact, a document, a photograph, or other evidence. The slide here describes bank records and account information. In all likelihood, obtaining the subject's bank records were a high priority in this investigative plan. So let's look at the components of an investigative plan. The allegation should be included because this helps the focus keep on the plan and the investigator reminded of the purpose of the investigation. Be clear, concise, and present a good objective reason for the investigation. A chronology and timeline can be very useful in figuring out who did what when. This also helps with potential witnesses. Investigative plans should list the evidence necessary to prove or disprove the allegation, and also include initial topics of questions that each witness could answer. And finally, there are logistical related issues that you want to document. So this is the plan template that we will use in the course. Investigative plans are essential to the management of a significant criminal investigation. Once prepared, they should be reviewed frequently, evaluated, modified, and revised as necessary to meet the requirements of the evolving investigation. So here across the top, you have the date that it was opened, other administrative information. Next, we look at the allegation. This is a concise synopsis of what has been alleged and is necessary to focus the investigation and avoid unnecessary or unproductive investigative activity. An allegation should identify the subject, if it's available, and include where they were located, the relevant time frame, and the improper conduct. Next, we want to thoroughly research and understand the applicable laws, regulations, policies early. We need to understand what standards apply, the language, the elements of the proof, and what the case law is. Correctly developing these will lead to the selection of the best witnesses to interview, the questions to ask, and the documents to obtain. We will continue to explore in more detail the elements of the offense. See the video that I prepared on this. Next, we move to the subject. In some cases, we don't know who the subject is, or it could be many people, but as we continue our investigation, we can add that in. It is important to remember that labels can change. So, for example, a witness can actually become the subject. Investigators must be knowledgeable about the people and organizations involved in their investigation as a fundamental step in preparing for interviews and obtaining the relevant facts and information needed. When possible, they should review documents that show the organizational structure and know the mission and function of the people that they are interviewing. This will help in contextualizing all the information provided through documents and witnesses. So now we move on to the heart, the evidence. What will we look for? We want to make sure that we have expeditious and unrestricted access to copies of all evidence and information based on the authority of the investigator. There are many policies in organizations that require personnel to fully assist and cooperate as an obligation of their employment. Reviewing personnel records can aid as well in determining and developing pertinent questions. We also want to look for social media postings and other useful information to collect during the fact-finding phase of this investigation. Finally, we look for resources and investigative issues. It's really important to think about the defense and what that could look like. We also are looking at about when we will probably complete the bulk of the investigation. And finally, we need to establish if there are any requirements to cost, to travel, uh, and if there are other alternatives. And again, this is the plan that is put together and updated and revised as needed. You may also hear the investigative plan referred to as an outline of proof. This is essentially the same thing. It was a tool developed primarily for attorneys and the military to prove elements in a court martial. But it is a tool that can be successfully adopted and work in tandem with an investigative plan that helps facilitate a well thought out investigative process. This is a graphical way of organizing the case, providing a construct for identifying the information, testimony, and documenting the investigative effort. Similar to the IP, it identifies the elements of the offense, the allegation, and by breaking it into separate parts that can be easily understood. So to build an outline of proof, we'll look at the table on the next slide, but it starts with the allegation, the essential elements, what needs to be proven or disproven, and constructing the table, and then revising as necessary. So let's take a look. So here it is. It's really simple. On the left, you have the essential elements, who did what, when, in violation of what standard or policy. You want to use a separate table for each allegation, and then break it down into testimony, documents, and other physical evidence. So here it is. Determining the types of evidence needed will help you label and collect that as appropriate. So this is an example of an outline of proof for two investigations. So for example, on the first one, we have an assistant manager who improperly used subordinates to perform personal tasks in violation of the Code of Federal Regulations and in this time frame. Next, we see a bank teller supervisor who stole $17,238 from a dormant account and in violation of two different federal codes and for a period of time, March through August. So this is examples you can use very, very easily. Start out with the allegations. Now, don't forget you can overplan and become hamstrung by the planning. You want to be flexible. Follow the leads where they ultimately go, not dismiss seemingly irrelevant details until and unless they've been thoroughly investigated, corroborated, or refuted. So, I hope you've enjoyed this short video. Assessing, focusing, and preparing for an investigation is a critical skill, and this is all about planning. What is the available evidence and information? What are the legal decisions, guidelines, and elements of the offense? What is the focus and scope of the case? What additional resources are required to thoroughly complete it? And how do we identify potential witnesses, suspects, documents, and evidence to organize and prioritize our investigative efforts? This is the investigative plan. It is the critical component of any case, especially a successful one, because it guides our investigation. It saves time, resources, and headaches later on. We can use it as our outline for our report. Identifying and prioritizing the investigative steps must be undertaken to a successful resolution, either proving or disproving the allegation. This ensures the legal requirements are being met, the appropriate techniques are utilized, and objective evidence is collected, secured, and documented. Thanks for joining us. Hope you like it, and feel free to leave any comments, thoughts, or questions. Take care.